And a pleasant good afternoon to everyone out there in Irish Breakdown land. I am Vince D'Addario. I am the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. That guy right there is Ryan Roberts. He is the director of recruiting at irishbreakdown.com. And we are going to continue with our position breakdowns, our spring preview breakdowns, position by position. We're going to go defensive line today. I will state the obvious. Brian is not here today. He is traveling back home to spend some time with his mom, since it is well aware that she had a successful surgery. So she is at home recovering. And so he's going to go home and hang out with her for a little bit. But that does not mean that he will be off to the shows for a week. He will be doing shows live from Pennsylvania, I believe. So, but he's heading home. He's traveling today. So, we're going to take over for today. But Brian wants to thank everybody for all their prayers and everything for his mom, and I know she's very thankful for that as well. So he's going to get a well-deserved day off today. So Ryan and I are going to hold down the fort. We're going to talk a little defensive line. Ryan, you ready for that?
Yeah, man, absolutely. It was fun when Brian asked me to come on here because obviously I've just been diving into the recruiting world mostly, but I've been a lifelong fan and keeping up with the team very closely. So I'm excited to talk about the actual roster, not just guys that may be on the roster in the future.
I know, right? And I just want to put it out there. We did get the schedule for spring and availability and all of that. And I got to say, I'm pretty fired up by the fact that the entire Irish Breakdown staff, we're going to be together in the same room at some point in the spring, because we're all going to go to the open practice. So pretty fired up about that. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, it really is. And I know we haven't even put it up to the message board yet, but yes, we will all be together on the 25th is the pro day at Notre Dame, which I will be in attendance. We will all be in attendance to my knowledge. And then the next day, the 26th, is the only media available practice of the spring practices for the team.
For the whole thing from start to finish. So I guess it works out that it's back to back for you. I mean,
yes,
coming in from out of town and Sean coming in from out of town. But yeah, it stinks that we only get one practice. And but hey, it is what it is. I am not going to lick a gift horse in the mouth, because as soon as I do, they'll take away that one practice that we get. So I will take what we can get, and then we get, I think, 4 other snippets of practice, right? So like the FSA plus 5 periods. So we get to watch them stretch, and then we get to watch 5 periods, and periods are 5 minutes long. And so basically we get about a half hour of practice, which, again, not going to look that gift horse right in the mouth, but I think it's a missed opportunity. Brian said it on the message board, so I will echo his thoughts. I think it is a missed opportunity, but it is what it is. It means I only have to take half day of work off all of those days. So it is what it is. So, but that is coming fast and furious. Net week and a half, right? Or no, it's 2 weeks from today. It's 2 weeks from today is the first practice of spring. And I will be there with bells on to watch them stretch and for the first 5 periods. And so that is how I'm going to kick off my St. Patrick's Day. And so I'm pumped up about that. And we will be hard and heavy right in through spring practice. So, yeah, full practice on the 26th, pro day. I will say, and I know we're getting off on a tangent here, but I don't care because Brian's not here. I am excited about the Blue Gold game draft. And I don't know why I'm excited about that. But I think that's going to be fun. It might actually be a game, as opposed to, random points for first downs and 3 and outs and, all of this nonsense. It might actually be a fun game to watch. I mean, we do drafts in gym class all the time, man. I'm fired up.
Yeah, no, it's usually good too. Cause obviously everybody's on scholarship, right? So like ones versus
Right.
twos or twos versus threes, whatever the situation is. Obviously, you're still going against good football players, but it'll be nice, I think, to kind of strategically have the talent in certain spots kind of divided a little more evenly, and I think it's just going to make for a better quality of a game outside of just kind of. I think being able to like simulate a true game atmosphere a little bit more than obviously like a controlled practice as much as you can. Obviously, you can't fully, but like getting it close. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Because you're going to have a mix of ones and twos, obviously, on the field. And I think it's going to be an opportunity for some guys to show out. You know what I mean? It might be an opportunity for a two to go up and do something fun against a one and vice versa. So I don't know. I'm looking forward to it. They're making a big deal out of it because the media is allowed to witness the entire draft. So I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. And it's at 7:45 in the morning or whatever. And so that'll be interesting all by itself. But it'll be a draft for the blue gold game. And Tyler wants to know who is picking the teams. I assume they're going to pick captains. If the players, I believe, are going to pick the teams, but I honestly don't know that for sure. I assume that's the way it's going to go down, but I guess we shall see.
Yep. To be determined.
TBD. TBD. Because that's not until like the end of the middle of April. So we have a long way to go before we hit that. So, Ryan, let's jump right in here. Let's talk defensive line for the 2022 Notre Dame football team. This is a group that was borderline elite last year. They have been borderline elite, if not elite, I think, for the last, 5-6 years. I think you could point to the defensive line as the strength of the Notre Dame defense and frankly, of the Notre Dame team as well. And I think that in order for 2022 to be a season where Notre Dame has success, I think you have to continue on with that pattern. I think that this group needs to take that next step. They need to be, if they're not elite, they need to be knocking on the door of elite, I think, from day one.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really notable too, because I would say that the defensive line is the most, not that anything's ever an actual sure thing, but it's the most sure thing because obviously there is some depth returning at linebacker with J.D. Bertrand and Maris Loifau coming back, and I have actually high expectations for the linebackers. But
sure,
we have to see obviously on the back ends. Brandon Joseph obviously coming in from Northwestern, who I'm really excited about, but he's still an unknown in a Notre Dame uniform. Obviously, you have Cam Hart, but the other spots in the secondary are still question marks that have to be answered. The defensive line. You lose Myron Tagovailoa-Amosa, who of course was a really good football player for Notre Dame, but for the most part, you bring everybody else back. So a unit that was really good last year, you would only expect another year of Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamalola and Justin Adamalola and Howard Cross and all these guys that we're going to be talking about briefly today. The ability for all of them to continue to develop and get better a year back and have the depth back from a unit that was, like you said, borderline elite, and only losing one significant production piece in there. I think that has to be one of the biggest, maybe the biggest, honestly, Vince, when you think about it, like position groups just on the team in general, that you're like, that is our bread and butter. That is the backbone of this team. Like they would have to be, right? With the production they have coming back.
Oh, I think so. I think they have to be. And you're right. I expect big things out of the linebackers this year. I think they obviously are going to get an influx of talent from the freshman class. I think the returning guys that they have can only get better. A lot of those guys were first-year starters. And so I expect that group to get better as well. But I think the stalwart from the defensive side has got to be the defensive line. And that's a great place to have the strength of your defense. Because the defensive line, obviously, if the defensive line is doing what they need to do, it allows the linebackers to flow and do things that they want to do. But then it also takes a lot of pressure off of the secondary, just like you mentioned, even though we have a lot of faith in some of the guys in the secondary, whether you're talking about Joseph or Cam Hart or whatever, it takes a lot of pressure off of those guys. And you can go a little bit more man-to-man in the back because they don't have to cover as long and all of these different measurables. The defensive line helps with all of that. And if you give me the option as to what I want a dominant defensive line. because they can dominate the run game. They can dominate the pass game. I mean, they can affect offenses across the board, right? And anything that they want to do. So I think Notre Dame's in a great place here, but they need to continue it. I mean, and guys are going to have to step up. I mean, you said it yourself. Myron Tagovailoa is leaving a hole. I mean, he is. He's leaving a hole. He was a great leader. He obviously moved out to end this past year, and I think that experiment overall could be called a success. I think he did a good job. He wasn't elite. I don't think that that's surprising anybody, but he was consistent. He brought his A game every day, and he did the best that he could, and he put himself in position to play at the next level. But I think they can take that position to another level potentially this year.
And I love how you mentioned, obviously, I would also agree that I would rather, and it's like the age-old question that's been asked over the last few years, would you rather have great pass coverage or would you rather have a great pass rush, right? Like, would the front four be more important than the back four, basically? And according to Pro Football Focus, it's the pass coverage. But in my opinion, and not to slander Pro Football Focus, I just had to get a little shot in there. But
yeah, we do that a lot.
Pass rush is always the king for me. That makes everybody behind them better, always.
Could not agree more with that. So let's jump into some specifics here. Number one, this is our spring preview. This is not necessarily our 2022 preview, which we will have in the summer. But going into the spring, I think it is of note that Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamiola are not going to participate in spring. They're going to be held back. I am not sure the 100% reasoning behind it. I know Brian does. He kind of sent us some notes, the things that he wanted us to mention. That was one of them. And so they are not going to participate in spring. So what does that mean for this Notre Dame front? Because we know that both of those guys are going to be elite. They're going to play. They're going to be stalwarts on this defensive line. So if they're not going to be available in the spring, what does that mean for the rest of this group? It means opportunities for more guys to step up, right?
Yeah, no, and I think it's going to be really important because there's a lot of intriguing depth. But I mean, right now, if you're pointing at two of the sure things again on the roster, Isaiah Foskey's one after his 10 sacks or whatever he had last year. Jason Adamalola for his penetration style, 3 technique work, and he's got obviously a lot of disruption to him. Those guys have played now, like at least last year, they played a ton of football, right? Like we've seen that. For me, their development's going to continue to grow with the physical development. I want to see Jason maybe put on a few more pounds of muscle. I want to see Isaiah continue to fill out that frame, even though I think he already has a nice frame, obviously, to deal with. But those guys both had opportunities and thought about going to the NFL after last season for the seasons that they had. Returning, I think physical development, taking that next step in leadership, that's the big moments for those types of that for those guys. For the leaders, because they're going to be leaders, even if they're, I know that
captains, yeah,
right. We don't know if they're going to be captains or whatnot, but they are, by all accounts, the leaders of the defensive line, and that allows now for added reps for guys that we're going to be getting into, like the Alexander Aaronsburgers of the world. We saw obviously Justin Adamalola get a lot better, obviously last year with increased snaps. We want to see him continue to grow. Howard Cross, Jacob Lacey. There's a lot of guys on the defensive line that we've seen a little bit, but they need more reps. They're younger guys for the most part, and they need that added improvement. And we have we know what to expect out of Foskey, even though I think both Foskey and Adamalola, Jason speaking, can still get a lot better. They're not finished products.
And that's why they came back, right? I mean, they both had opportunities to leave and go to the NFL, and they both decided to come back. So either they didn't hear what they wanted to hear from the NFL, or with some self-scout and all of that, they realized, okay, there is more of a ceiling here. There's an opportunity to get better. There's an opportunity to be part of something potentially special on this team. So they decided to come back. So I agree with you. We think that there's another level of play for these guys. And I would think that they have to believe that as well. Otherwise they would have gone on to the NFL.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's definitely, after every season, I like to think there's a little bit of a self-evaluation period, right? Like, did I make the right step? And obviously both guys in theory at least, did not get the NFL feedback that they quite wanted. And I think that they're both high-level NFL prospects potentially next year. So getting another year of maturation physically, I think is going to be huge because, I mean, the whole thing with Jason is Jason's just kind of a lightly built defensive tackle. He's right around 280 pounds. Well, this is the opportunity now to put on a little bit of weight because usually you're going to be sweating that off during the spring, working off that weight type of thing in practice situation. Isaiah Foskey, I mean, you're still going to get the opportunity to sit back and learn and have those leadership qualities and continue to grow from a physical development. So those things are all still aware. And then those guys, though, that have played the most reps, they'll still be present, right? Like they're obviously not going to be performing as far as like practicing, but they'll still be able to tutor the younger guys, the Nana Safamenses and those, those caliber players. And I think somebody in the chat said it, the backups, quote unquote, the depth pieces that will now be thrust into a higher role of volume of snaps are going to be going against the starters on the offensive line every single day. And that's going to give them valuable reps. And I think the difference between being a very good defensive line and being a potentially elite one is that when the second units come in, when the backups come in, there's not a huge drop off. And that's, I think, the next step for this defensive line. The top level is awesome. The second, third levels are very promising, but we want to see them obviously take that next step where, I mean, last year with Georgia, like you could take Devontae Wyatt and Jordan Davis and Nolan Smith and all these guys off the field and put in the second units, and they're still dynamic. And I think that that's the next step for Notre Dame's defensive line.
Yeah, it's the lack of drop off from 1 to 2. I mean, and that's so key. It's depth. And we had talked about this many, many times. Brian and I have had this discussion in the past. They've been really good with that first group. And it's the drop off to the second group. And they've gotten better there. Like the depth has gotten a lot better at Notre Dame, but there still needs to be more. There still needs to be that next step of production across the board, right? And who's going to step into those roles? And I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions going forward and what we're going to find out during the spring. And just to throw it all back up onto the pile, they have a new position coach as well. With Coach Washington coming in from Ohio State, and he was from Ohio State, right? I want to make sure I get that right. So he's coming up.
He was a linebacker coach for the last couple years, but his roots are at the defensive line. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's coming over. So you've got a new voice in the room. Everything that goes along with that, learning how to play for a different coach, because obviously Mike Elston was one of the longest tenured coaches at Notre Dame. So not a lot of change in that defensive line room. Now you've got that change. And so that just adds another piece to this spring puzzle moving forward, is just that new voice from the coach.
Yeah. No, I mean, you illustrated it perfectly, I think, Vince, because, I mean, Mike Elston was obviously a really good defensive line coach. And obviously Notre Dame fans are going to miss him and the team's going to miss him. Of course, you don't lose that quality of coach and not miss him at all. But right. I think bringing in and Al Washington, who has, I mean, his roots were at Boston College, developing guys like Harold Landry, right, who ended up becoming second-round pick and has been one of the better pass rushers now in the NFL over the last couple years. I think he had like 13 or 14 sacks this year, right? Like that was an underrecruited kid that Al Washington got a hold of and developed to being that type of player. And then he spent obviously the last couple years from Ohio State coaching linebackers, but I mean, obviously did a great job with the linebackers for Ohio State for the most part. This last year, they had a lot of inexperience, but the year before you're talking about guys like Baron Browning and Pete Warner and all those guys who did a really good job. So he's been around and he has a different philosophy, I'm sure, than a Coach Elston. He has different nuances to how he teaches the position, which even if Foskey and Adamalola are not firsthand practicing, they're still taking that stuff in. And that could be things as, from technical perspective on the field to a film evaluation perspective, to being able to break down film, to understand the mental side of the game. So I think Al Washington is going to have his imprint on this team very early on. And I'm excited to see that maturation because it's going to look a little different. And sometimes different isn't great, but sometimes different is very good. So I'm obviously the optimism in the room. I think that it's going to be a great fit. And I think it's going to be a spring of growth, to say the least.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the big end, because I think this is where there's a lot of question. And I'm not saying in a bad way. I'm saying that we just don't know. And that's the spot that MTA is leaving vacant, right? And so you've got Nana Safamensa, he came in very highly regarded. He was, heralded when he got in here, but he was raw. He was very raw. And I think that it was understood that he would come in and there was a lot of potential there, but it was going to take some time, right? And then he's had some injuries, I believe, some things of that nature. But as far as I know, he's 100% healthy, ready to compete for this position. I mean, he's going to be a senior school-wise, which I remember him walking in the door, but that's all crazy to me by itself. So you got Nana Asaf-Mensah, you got Alexander Ahrensberger, who saw some increased playing time down the stretch. A very impressive playing time. Those two guys coming in are very intriguing. They're going to get a lot of reps in the spring. And I think we're going to see, is Nana ready to take on, that starter's role? Is Alexander ready to be that start? Who's going to be that number one guy? Because I think that's still a question mark moving forward.
I do like that we have two very different body types and very different stylistically, because I think that they could, if both of those players, Nana and Ahrensberger, take a step forward, I feel like we're working with two very different players. And I think that we were talking about how players mesh together, because you're going to throw out a Nana Asaf-Mensah who's not the biggest dude in the world. Right around 6'2", 6'3", 250 something pounds, somewhere in that ballpark. But you're going to throw him around, and then the very next play you could have a 6'7", 250 something pound Alexander Ahrensberger.
For days,
And I'll say this, Vince. I know obviously when Notre Dame signed Ahrensberger, it was going to be a long road because he's coming from Germany, and it's he obviously is still getting acclimated to the American game. But when he's had his opportunities, he's flashed some nice stuff, man. Like, he's had a few sacks in just some limited amount of time, and you see kind of the penetration and obviously that length that you talk about. Length at that position, at that big end spot, is a big bonus, obviously. Being able to handle down blocks and work against tight ends and do all that type of stuff. But then, again, you throw in a Nana Asaf-Mensah, who's a little bit smaller, but more of a slippery type of dude that has, a little more foot quickness potentially than an Ahrensberger. I'm excited to see how those two mesh together, and obviously the evolution of their games just individually. But I think that it's interesting to see at a position that we have just such different body types potentially for Notre Dame. I think that's what it makes kind of really interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's going to be, I think they need more pass rush ability from the big end position, a little bit more production, I guess, in the pass rush on that side, because look, we know what we're going to get on the other side, right? We know what Isaiah Foskey brings to the table from the Viper position. We're going to assume that he's going to take his game to another level. And I think Brian has talked about this in the past. Even if his numbers aren't any better this year than they were last year, meaning the 21, that's fine. As long as you see growth in some other areas that aren't necessarily tangible numbers, right? But from the big end position, and again, I don't want anybody to think that I'm knocking MTA, because that is not the direction that I'm trying to take here. But if you bring in a guy like Alexander Ahrensberger, who's just got those long arms, and he's kind of twitchy off the get-go, and then like
a little more juice.
Yep. And Nana is just a little bit more compact, but he is slippery as well. You've got a different dynamic out there that I think could translate into being more of a pass rush from the big end. And if you can get more production out of the big end from a pass rush situation, I only think that can help this defensive line.
Obviously, we need both of them to be able to do obviously work in the run game, right? Like, that's obviously the big point of the big end, is to work against double teams, to work against tight ends blocking down, to be able to fight pressure, do all that type of stuff. But I agree completely in the sense that you knew Myron was going to give you a very good baseline. He was going to be a really solid football player. Yes. But having that pass rush upside, because Vince, honestly, everybody's going to be looking at 7 this year.
Absolutely.
Offensively. They're going to be looking at 57. Like, those are going to be the guys where you're like, where are we going to bring an extra? Where are we going to leave the running back in on what side? Where are we going to slide protection? Who are we going to double team?
Sure.
It's going to be 7 and it's going to be 57. So the other couple of positions on the defensive line, depending if Notre Dame is running a 3-man or a 4-man front, are going to have some one-on-one opportunities at times. So they have to be able to take advantage, because I don't think it's just a simple fact where you can just expect Isaiah Foskey to match the double-digit sacks or even improve upon it because everybody knows who 7 is now at this point.
Absolutely. Yes.
The emphasis now is going to be the other guys winning one-on-one opportunities, being able to capitalize on those opportunities. And that's what this spring is about, being able to have those opportunities and to grow. I think it's a huge opportunity for the big end position.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I think it's one of the things I love about college football is the turnaround, right? You get to see some of these young guys who you saw come in, and look, these guys were both projects when they got to Notre Dame, for different reasons, but they were both projects, and now they both have the opportunity to potentially start at Big End, and one's going to start, and one's probably going to get a heck of a lot of playing time, and I think that's fun. I'm really looking forward to seeing what these two guys can do in the spring with this opportunity. Obviously, the sitting out of 7 and 57 is not going to necessarily affect those two guys, but it does affect them because they're not going to be playing with those guys, right? And that is definitely something that they're going to have to get used to in the fall. But they need to put the blinders on a little bit, and they need to worry about, okay, how do I get myself on the field? How do I become the most productive version of myself and get myself into, a lot of PT? And they're going to have that opportunity in spades, I think, this spring. Now, there are a couple of other guys. Another intriguing part of this defensive line, because there is a new coach, there's a slightly different scheme, right? They're kind of 3 down, 4 down. We'll see what Al Golden wants to do, since this is going to be his defense, right? Are there going to be some positional switches? Are there going to be some guys that are going to move around? Justin Adamiola started out at Big End. Then he moved over to Viper. Does he cross-train a little bit? Is he stuck at Viper because Isaiah's out? What does it look like for him?
Yeah, and I think that I think Justin is at the point where he had obviously a pretty productive season last year, splitting reps there, obviously at Viper for the most part. I think you have the opportunity where you could cross-train him if you feel solidly about the Viper position outside of, obviously, for the spring, besides Isaiah. I personally still like him a little better at Viper because I just think that stylistically that's where he fits best, and I kind of like the ability of like hit him almost. I don't want to call him a sub-package player because I think he can play a high volume of snaps, but the possibility of bringing both of those in, both him and Foskey in on obvious pass rush situation, and maybe you have a big end where you can kick inside on pass rushing downs. Like that's kind of where I see for a Justin. But I think the really nice part is that Justin is a guy that had production, but he still hasn't had a ton of snaps in his career. That last year was his first real year with a substantial amount, a high volume of snaps to a degree. So the growth I think is going to be huge for him because I think that he's going to kind of be that Viper per se during the spring. I don't anticipate him taking I anticipate him cross-training a little bit, but for the most part, I see him sticking at Viper, and I see that that's just going to be a huge opportunity for him to take a step forward because he is going to be, in my opinion, the number one Viper throughout the spring for Notre Dame with Foskey not there. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I think the reps are going to be massive for him at Viper. And, again, that could only help him out. And I think that having him cross-trained in both positions is going to benefit them in the fall. But in the spring, I agree with you. I think he's probably going to stick at Viper and dominate there.
Well, yeah, because like my one thing, Vince, is like we know that Justin Adamalola is going to play a ton, but if you start messing around with, hey, we're gonna move him at strong side ends, kind of forecasting for the future, then if you get into a situation where you're just like in the season, Foskey's awesome, obviously. We still really like Justin at Viper, trying to mix him in at that position. You took reps away from someone during the spring at the big end position. So I'd rather than just stick with him at Viper, let him continue to develop because he's going to get a high volume of snaps. And then players that Notre Dame needs to depend on at the big end are going to also get a high volume of snaps. So I think that just makes the most sense logistically for me.
Let me ask you about Riley Mills. Where do you see Riley Mills kind of landing, I guess, starting in the spring and then maybe into the fall as well. But in the spring, Where do you see him at?
Well, I mean, originally I liked him a little more at 3-tech, to be honest, but just kind of listening to Brian's ideology and just opinion on the fact, I am kind of morphing my thought, because for me, I think that he can play strong side defensive end with the length that he has, and I think that he brings a lot more of that juice, kind of twitchiness that you talked about comparative to a Myron. At least he brings that stride length, right? Like that kid can eat up ground in a split second. I mean, later in the year, he was playing some strong side defensive end, and he was productive at it too. So I think he's the player, when I was talking about before, of strong side defensive end on base downs, and then on passing downs or third down, whatever it is, you're going to move that kid inside. Speaking about Riley Mills.
Kind of a NASCAR look, or however you want to, like a speed rush. You know, if you're third down, hey, we're putting our best, pass rushers on the field.
Yeah, because I think that he can win against offensive tackles with the length that he has, and I think he has enough, obviously, juice as a pass rusher. But when you're talking about now getting 6'5" with long arms and foot quickness inside against guards on obvious passing downs, that's where I feel like he causes the most problems, is his length. And I think length on passing downs against guards is more of a plus than working against offensive tackles full time. So I just think that he offers a lot of possibilities flex wise, but I think on base downs, I really am starting to buy into the fact that Riley Mills could be that guy that kind of captures, quote unquote, the big end position, because I think I think it just gives you so much flexibility, alignment wise, especially with Notre Dame that wants to play some 3-man. They want to play some 4-man. I think he could just do so many different things that calling him a base strong end gives you a little bit of alignment versatility.
Yeah, I think he's going to be very versatile on this defensive line. And, he's sitting at 283, 285, something along those lines. So he's up there with one of the heaviest defensive linemen that they have on the roster right now. I think he's got to be top 4 in that neighborhood. And so he can bang inside. He can bang in, at that 3 technique without much of a problem. But I do like his length on the outside. So I think that of all the guys that we've talked about up to this point, going from outside to inside, I think he's got the most versatility there going into the spring and then into the fall as well.
Yeah, no, and like you said, he's one of the heaviest defensive linemen they have too. I mean, I think obviously Gabriel Rubio's a little bit heavier, but I mean the other guys, Jacob Lacey's in the 280 something range, Howard Cross is in the 280 range. Like they're not the biggest defensive line, because obviously the structure of the defense has changed a little bit. Like I think that your typical nose tackle that you would kind of think in your head, that's not how Notre Dame plays defense, right? Like there are a very gap penetrating. They want to create havoc. They're not just hold the point and just hold up blockers. Like that's not what Marcus Freeman or Al Golden, I'm assuming, is going to want to do. So they're going to have smaller defensive linemen. And I think that, a guy like Riley Mills, whether he's working inside or out, he's going to play a lot of snaps just because of the problems that he could cause from a matchup dictating perspective.
Absolutely. And again, another fun kid to watch. Another spot that's going to be interesting that is left wide open due to graduation is the nose tackle spot. And I'm really curious as to how Notre Dame is going to use their nose tackles. What is that going to look like moving forward? With the 3 down and the 4 down and all these different things that they want to do. Because right now I think it's Jacob Lacey, right? Maybe Gabriel Rubio as well at nose. Are those the 2 guys you kind of see as the front runners for that spot right now?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, I think the interesting part, and I know we're going to talk about it a little bit, is like, what do you do with Howard Cross? Because obviously he's played a lot at nose as well, and he's got kind of that disrupting feel to him. My guy, and I think it was just me and Brian on for this one, Vince. So I don't think that you were on, unfortunately, but I was talking about how I thought one of the breakout stars for next year could be Jacob Lacey, because I feel like every time I see him, I feel like he's causing problems. He's causing havoc. He's getting a tackle for loss. He's, causing the things to bounce and with the penetration that he has inside. So I think that he's a guy that's obviously dealt with a little bit of injuries, but he's been a productive football player. And I think that he can bring a lot to this defense if he is able to stay healthy. And then if he is able to take his game to the next level to the degree that I think he can, having a healthy Gabriel Rubio back, which we just talked about Riley Mills and the length that he has and being a big bonus. I mean, Gabriel Rubio is the longest guy you got inside right now, unless you want to count Tyson Ford as an inside guy, even though he's more of a strong side defensive end as well. So, I mean, he's got
90. I mean, that's some length down there in the middle.
Yeah, no, absolute length, and he's got foot quickness too. Like he's not like just a big dude that's going to take up blockers. Like he can do that because he has that length and he has that power profile. But he's also, I think, is another slippery player, a guy that can work in. If he wanted to be a one gap guy instead of like a two gap type of player, he can do that. So you take a 6'1", 6'2", 285 Jacob Lacey, who's a real penetration one gap type of player, and then you bring a 6'5". 290, just the difference, man. You're throwing out different body types, which for offensive linemen, it just makes it so difficult because then you just have to switch up your mindset, your aiming points. Like it just messes you up because, I mean, all of a sudden you're working against a Gabriel Rubio who's a little bit longer, 6'5", so your pad level doesn't matter quite as much. And then the next play, a Jacob Lacey comes in and then he gets right under your pads because you're just not used to that length and that level of pad level. So I think, again, there's outstanding possibilities what Notre Dame has because I think there's a blending of different styles, which makes this. I mean, if it is Lacey and Rubio ultimately that do get the most of the snaps at nose guard, I feel like that's a very interesting mix for that spot.
No, that's a really good point as far as the different body types that are playing the same exact position because, and then you've got Howard Cross, you throw him in there and he's just a shade over 6 foot, right? So, he brings that load to the ground, that exact same thing. So, once again, I just think that Notre Dame's going to be able to bring waves at offensive line at offensive line men, excuse me.
Yes.
And it's going to be great for Notre Dame. I mean, if these guys all pan out the way that we think that they will, it's going to be fantastic. And one of the guys in the chat is mentioning Aiden Kiana. I mean, he's the biggest body that they've got, period. Right. I mean, he's the only guy that's listed over 300 pounds, to my knowledge, as I quickly look through the roster here. I mean, he's 6'3", 310. And he hasn't seen a bunch of playing time yet. And so I think he's going to get an opportunity with Jason Adamiola being out, to get some playing time in the spring as well.
Yeah, no, and he's obviously, like you said, he's a big body and a guy that was, I mean, it's a nice place to be because I feel like all these guys we're talking about are former 4-star recruits, right? That are like good football players, and Aiden obviously has not gotten that playing time yet, but I think that he's going to have an opportunity to fight for that. And then you mentioned Howard Cross, who I know is like a big talking point because he's played nose, but he's a little bit of a smaller guy. He's got that penetration style, which could kind of parlay success at nose guard or at 3 technique, but I'm interested to see what they do with him because I don't know if he's a perfect quote unquote fit at either spot, but I think he can be productive at either spot because I think he just brings an interesting mesh of profile. Like he's again, I don't think because he's like you said, it's a hair over 6 foot, right around 280 pounds. He definitely doesn't look like your traditional nose tackle, obviously. He's, in the Aaron Donald-ish mold when we're talking about like profile, but then he's a former defensive end coming out of New Jersey. And he's got some foot quickness to him. So it's not like he's just this guy that just doesn't have any traits to work with. Like this kid's an explosive player, which makes a really interesting one, I think, for him.
No question. I mean, they've got options on the inside. There's no doubt about that. And seeing how that all kind of comes together. And again, I do feel like having Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamiola sitting out in the spring is only going to benefit the depth of this group because that's that many more snaps on the inside. It's that many more snaps at the Viper position for Justin, and then whoever is going to be playing behind him. It is going to reap its benefits. And look, it may look shaky at times, during the spring, but you're going to have to remind yourself, okay, it's spring. Their 2 best defensive linemen aren't in the game. They're off to the side learning and taking their mental reps and teaching kids, etc. But you are preparing for the future, whether that future is this fall with depth or whether that future is beyond 2022. This is going to be a crucial spring, I think, for this defensive line.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a huge spring, especially obviously with Marcus Freeman taking over as head coach, his first spring, with the team in a head coaching capacity, having Al Washington coming in that we mentioned, obviously, is going to be a big step, I think. Let me ask you, Vince, because I know I kind of intro the conversation with Howard Cross a little bit. He's played a lot of nose. He kind of has a profile that could play some 3-tech. What position do you think that you would, I don't want to say prefer, but what position do you think that he might project best to, at least working in the spring?
Well, it's funny because Cross and Lacey, it feels like they've been at Notre Dame forever. I feel like I see those guys. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot they're still here, and so they're going to get a great opportunity. But I feel like his size projects him more as a nose, but I feel like his game projects more as a 3 technique, if that makes sense. And for me, that's kind of the best of both worlds, because with the scheme that they want to run, having him available to play both, I think will only enhance the depth and will allow him to get on the field a little bit more, because I think you're going to see him at both spots. I really do.
Interchangeable.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And the more he can make himself that important, the better off he's going to be. And, again, this is a glass half full, prediction, but if he can show out at both positions, I think obviously that just makes them that much stronger.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I feel like Notre Dame is moving towards, and if you disagree, please come back on it. But I feel like it's almost, because obviously you're always going to have your nose, you're going to have your 3 techs. Like you're going to have the distinguishments between those two. I don't even know if distinguishment's a word, but yeah, they're always going to have some distinguishing traits between those two. But I almost feel like it's getting a little more interchangeable with how they play defense now, because like you said, Howard Cross can play both. I think Jacob Lacey could play both. Gabriel Rubio could probably play both. Riley Mills could play all over the place. The defensive ends, the Viper for Notre Dame, Isaiah Foskey, is 6'5", 260. Like he could play strong side defensive end if he had to. We're talking about Justin maybe playing a little bit of both. So I think there's an interchangeableness that's coming now with the front under Marcus Freeman. I feel like it's been going there for a couple of years, even before Coach Freeman got there. But I really think that we're getting to a point now when we look at Notre Dame that I feel like there is going to be, it's almost like the nameless football, right? Or whatever they call it. I don't even know what the word is. The positionless football is the word I was looking for.
There you go.
Yeah, that Phil Snow and it was trying to make a thing in Carolina, which has its merits and it has its inconsistencies, but it's an interesting one where you don't have to recruit just for one profile. You're finding guys. I mean, talking about in the 2023 recruiting class for a second, if I could just go off on like a quick tangent,
please.
Isaiah Foskey is 6'6", 235 pounds, which he's being recruited to play Viper. But I mean, that kid's going to be 260 before he knows it. Like he's going to blink his eyes one day. He's going to be 6'6", 265. And he's going to be a kid that can interchangeably play between Viper and strong side defensive end. You have a guy like Brendan Vernon in the class where he's going to start as a strong side defensive end, but he might be a kid that could also play inside a 3-tech down the line. So I think that Tyson Ford is a young man that we're going to talk about a little bit. I think he could play multiple spots in this defensive line. There's just a lot more versatility and variety, I think, now with this defensive line, which makes it really interesting. I feel like the labels are almost thrown out the window. At this point, we're just putting guys on the defensive line and saying, you're a strong side defensive end by name, but like you could also play Viper. I think it's becoming closer to not as much cross training as it just is the fact that players can just do so much more with how they're recruiting the defensive line right now. It's really cool just to kind of think about it a little bit.
Well, since you brought it up, let's talk about the two guys that are early enrollees for Notre Dame. You've got Tyson Ford, you've got Aiden Gobira. They're both here. They're both ready and willing and able to get in there and get in the mix. Let's put it this way. You know these guys really well. What do you think is a successful spring for those two guys?
I think it's very different. So in the perfect world, I think trying to find some pass rush reps from the freshman group would be a big bonus, right? Like I don't think that either of them have to be forced into it, but I think if an Aiden Gobira, for instance, took the onus and showed out a little bit on pass rushing downs, if he became somewhat of a specialized pass rusher as a freshman, or if it was a Tyson Ford, that would be phenomenal. But for me, I want to see if either one of them are able to really hit the ground running a little bit, because they've obviously have been in the winter conditioning now. They've been able to, being on campus, they've been able to kind of acclimate themselves as students and get all that work in. I want to see the growth that both of them just had since they got on campus, because I think that the upside is Aiden Gobira, I feel like, can fight for reps to being on in a third down specialist. I think Tyson Ford is a player, like I said, strong side defensive end at 6'5", 260 plus, makes a lot of sense, but he's also a player that I think could eventually work inside. So I want to see what his body looks like during the spring. I want to see if he's put on a ton of weight, because for me, I feel like Tyson, out of those two, and I don't know if you agree with this, Vince, out of those two, I would rather see Gobira play early, just based upon, I think his projection's a little easier to like a specified role. Tyson Ford, I think, has a higher upside as like a long-term investment, but he's a guy that I think is kind of just still growing into his body. And even though he's 6'5", 260, I could see him putting on a substantial amount of weight, and then he could be in that similar conversation to Riley Mills, where like a couple years from now, we're like, is he a strong side defensive end? Is he a 3-tech? What position can he work at? He can work at both potentially. So I think successful is you see growth, obviously, from the first practice to the end. You see either one of them can grab just kind of a specialized role. Gobira, I think, is the guy for me that I look at and I say, if he can provide just some pass rush reps as a freshman, not a ton, obviously, because he's a freshman, but just some spots where he can come in and show his outside trackability, his speed that he has coming off the edge. And then I want to see Tyson Ford. I mean, he should play, obviously. Like, he should at least play in the 4 games that he gets off the redshirt rule. But I want to see where his body's going to develop and just kind of his game develop, because I think that long-term – he's a player that's going to take a little more time, because I don't think his body's done growing. I mean, neither one of them body are done growing, but I think that he has even more growth upside than maybe comparative to an Aiden Gobira. But I think Gobira's floor might be a little higher, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And they've already got listed on Notre Dame's website. They've got Ford listed at 269. So he's an Oreo away from 270, and coming in as an early enrollee freshman at 270. And the way that he's able to move, you would assume he's going to be able to put more weight on that body frame. You know what I mean? That's just give him a year under Bayless, and I feel like things are gonna change, and so he may end up being pushed inside, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think so anyway, because they've got some studs coming in behind him as well, and then they've got talent on the outside right now at Notre Dame, so that just strengthens the inside, which we have talked in the past about how, okay, they're going and getting all these defensive ends, which is great. What happens to the inside? Where are they with defensive tackle and things of that nature? Well, if Tyson Ford can make himself into an elite tackle, well, then that takes away some of those issues.
Yeah. And I feel like you're seeing it again kind of on the 2023 recruiting side of things as well. As I think Notre Dame is moving towards, we're going to get long defensive linemen that can grow into interior players. I don't think they're just projecting guys that are just strictly interior players. They're going to try to figure that out, because Brendan Vernon could be an interior player eventually. They're recruiting Jason Moore out of DeMatha Catholic that is 6'6", 270 pounds, could be an interior player. Devin Houston out of St. James School of Maryland is another guy that they are interested in, that is 6'5", 275 pounds, who has the growth potential to being a defensive tackle. So I don't think that it's as much, recruiting defensive tackles versus defensive ends. I feel like they are now just taking the body types that they like and letting them becoming what they become. I think that there's a reality where Tyson Ford is a defensive end on the majority snaps, and there's also a reality where he could be, a 3 technique in that sense as well. So I think they're taking athletic body, long body types on defensive line, and they're letting them develop because like you said, the one consistency, or not one consistency, but one of the consistencies of the Notre Dame program has been Bayless, obviously, as the strength and conditioning coach. And I don't know if you listened to Inside the Garage podcast that has Kyle Hamilton and all those guys.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, they mentioned it's like when all the transitional period stuff was happening, they're like, But we have Coach Bayless. That's the guy. Like, that keeps everything afloat. That keeps everything kind of moving forward. So having those long athletic body types with Bayless, having the opportunity with him to work with guys like Riley Mills and Tyson Ford and Keon Keeley and Brandon Vernon moving forward, like those body types, let's see what they develop. You're not necessarily going to call them defensive tackles early on, but like that's where they could eventually fit in, because that's just the growth potential that they have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I, frankly, even with, and honestly, you want to be full strength. Any coach wants to be full strength all the time. I mean, as you know, as a high school coach, you know, as a spring coach, I can't wait for the winter sports to get over so that I can get the guys in and we can be full strength again. You know, everybody wants to be full strength, but if you can't be full strength, like the defensive line is not going to be in the spring, it can benefit you. And I think it's going to benefit Notre Dame. I really do. I have no qualms about the fact that Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamiola are going to be just fine in the fall if they don't take a single rep in the spring, right? And it's only going to develop the depth that they have, and it's going to make them better in the long run. And again, you're like, oh, man, you know, Isaiah could do this so much better, or, you know, Jason could do this so much better. You know, we'd be dominating the offensive line right now if we had those two guys, and, you know, all of these different things. Of course, the competitor in Coach Washington and Coach Golden, that's going to be what they're going to be thinking, right? But once they get to fall and they get those guys in there and they realize the steps that the depth has taken at the defensive line position, it's going to be like, okay, all right, it was rough, but you know what? We're good now, and it's just going to make us better moving forward. So I love watching those two guys play. So it's you know, I wish I could watch those guys play in the spring, but I think it's going to be even more fun to watch these young guys take steps and get to where, you know, this could be an elite defensive line. They're going to be knocking on the door of elite, I think, regardless, depending on what kind of spring they have, and then moving into what kind of fall that they can have. They could be a very elite, you know, defensive line. And somebody said in the chat they wanted to know, hey, you know, it seems like, here, I'll throw it up here. We'll do a couple questions. Mm-hmm. William Campbell says our defensive line seems small. How will they do against teams with 310-plus pound offensive linemen? You know what? I'd rather take speed and athleticism over you know, big, huge offensive linemen any day of the week. I think Notre Dame's going to be just fine.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think that's, I mean, the obviously there's positives and bonuses to having, I mean, positives and bonuses. There's positives and negatives having the smaller defensive line, right? I'm talking about a one gap system versus a two gap system. And a one gap, that's like an attack style defense. You want guys to work into gaps, and you'd want to use athleticism. That's what Notre Dame, I think, is going to really kind of harness this year, is the fact that Howard Cross isn't the longest guy in the world. He's not the biggest guy in the world. Jacob Lacey isn't the biggest guy in the world, but they're both incredibly quick, working for either from a nose or from a three tech. So that's how you kind of counter that, William, is that the fact that, like, you're not going to send these guys straight down the chest and ask them to two gap against 310 plus offensive linemen, but you can ask them to work shoulders, to work gaps, and then to use that quickness to their advantage. It's a great question, William. Very good question.
Absolutely. We do have a super chat here from Jay. Thanks for the super chat, Jay. I'm going to let you read this one because I will butcher that last name.
I probably am too. So it says, add 4-star defensive end Desmond Umazolu out of Maryland to the offer list at defensive line. Offers this cycle. Love to see it. Yes, Jay. If you're not on the message board, I put on the post probably less than 10 minutes from when Desmond had made the announcement. And then I also have an article coming out in the very near future about the offer. It's going to kind of break down, you know, a little bit of the offer list that Desmond has, the recruiting profile. And I mean, another guy, Vince, we keep talking about how Notre Dame is really taking advantage of the Maryland, DC area this year. This kid is a pretty much consensus top 150 defensive end, 6'5", 6'6", 220 pounds, very athletic. It's so weird. He's like a top 150 kid by every platform on three and Rivals and everything. And ESPN doesn't even have him rated, which is a little odd, but he is a very athletic kid, and another kid who, you know, looks like a Viper right now. But again, it's 6'5", 6'6", down the road, we'll see how he develops. So Notre Dame is obviously interested in him. Coach Washington offered him himself. So add Desmond to a very talented board.
Very good. Very good. And let's see if we've got some more questions that I can pull here. I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to pull it up so people don't think that I'm, ignoring it. David wants to know, did Bayless play football in the past? I don't know what his history is, to be perfectly honest with you. And I know a lot of times on their profiles that they have their history and what they did in the past. It really just has his strength and conditioning accomplishments.
Yeah, I was looking at it, and it was mentioned in like when he was in coaching in high school and all that type of stuff. So it doesn't mention a playing career for him.
Yeah, he taught physical education at the elementary school level. Good for him. I like that. Let's see if we've got any more questions that we want to. If you guys have questions, by the way, you can go ahead and throw them in. We'll stick around for a couple more minutes and answer some of these questions. But if you've got some, you want to throw them in. You know what? Let's jump into the combine right now. There's a chance that you might do a show just on the combine itself, but I know that you're locked into the combine and what's going on there. So I'm just going to open the floor. Give me your thoughts on the combine up to this point.
Yeah, I heard that it's been a little. So there's been a little bit of back and forth with the combine. So last week, it was early in the week, there was a passing by the NFL combine that basically said that they were going to do a bubble system, right? Everybody was going to have to. There was going to be no trainers allowed in. There was going to be no agents allowed in. The players were just there by themselves. They weren't able to leave, all that good stuff. So obviously there was a big pushback, right? Because the agents are like, they're already in a uncomfortable environment. It's a place they've never worked out in, on a schedule they never had before. And then you're taking the support systems away from them, basically. So a few agents got together and they're like, nope, all our clients are not going to do this. So they had at one point 150 players that were ready to say, boycotting. We're good. Wow. We're not going to participate in the combine.
Holy cow.
Quickest pivot I've ever seen, Vince. Literally the next day, less than a day, they're like, just kidding, guys. No more bubble. We're good. So, yeah, they quick pivot. So that got everything off to a weird spot. I heard yesterday there was media availability that got delayed like over an hour because some medicals got delayed. So like it's just been kind of weird so far. So right now, the set for later today, 4:00 Eastern, is going to be the quarterbacks, wide receivers, and running backs will be working out today. The biggest headline of the day is that Kenny Pickett's hand size finally came in. He's 8.5 inches, which is it would be the tied for the smallest hands ever drafted in the first round. Maybe drafted ever, but Mike Vick also had 8.5-inch hands, which for anybody that isn't an NFL draft nerd like I am, 9 inches is considered the threshold. That's when you start getting into guys like Jared Goff and Joe Burrow. That's kind of like the cutoff, quote unquote. So anytime you're below
there to there,
stretch from the. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry. I'm going to go measure my hand after this.
I just realized that some people may be listening to this to a podcast too. So on the podcast, what I just did was you stretch out your hands all the way. You measure from the tip of your thumb to the tip of your pinky, and that is the measurement for the hand size. So why does it matter? People are going to argue that it doesn't. Historically speaking, there's been only one other quarterback drafted that's been somewhat successful, less than 9-inch hands. Kenny Pickett had 38 fumbles during his Pittsburgh career. So like it might matter a little bit. So that's kind of been the headline, but I'm excited for some of the testing. Obviously there's unfortunately more guys, it seems. And I know it's actually not more guys, but like Evan Neal from Alabama is not going to be participating. Derek Stingley Jr. is not going to be participating. There's some guys that are dealing with injuries. There's some guys that just kind of chosen not to do it, but it's been a lot of fun. If you're not in the message board, there is a post I made about just NFL draft basically commentary or questions if you want to go talk NFL draft, because I'm a nerd with that type of stuff. So please feel free.
There you go. So that's a great segue to signing up for the message board right down there. Boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Come join the Irish Breakdown family, because you never know what's going to happen over there. You never know what conversations are going to get started. And we know Ryan wants to talk NFL draft, and I knew that if we started talking about it, we'd be in great shape. So no problem there. So make sure you join. And then make sure you hit that like button on the podcast today. Hit that like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, because you never know when there might be a night show, when somebody, signs on to be part of Notre Dame, commits, all of those different things. So you never know when there's going to be one of those shows. So if you're listening on the podcast, make sure you subscribe there, share with your family and friends. Again, hit that like button, everybody. Give us a help. Give us a hand. Again, Brian should be back tomorrow. Tomorrow is the mailbag, so it'll be the first hour with me, and then I would say the second hour, but it's usually more than that with Ryan and Brian. A lot of times I'm getting out of school and you guys are still going. Just wanted to put that out there. But you guys, all three of us will be back for the mailbag tomorrow. So make sure you sign in and check us out tomorrow at 12:30. So for Ryan, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.